All right. Well, let us begin. Actually, Elaine does not need an introduction. In the circle. So, yes. So, thank you for agreeing to share with us some of your observations, learnings, and discoveries of your time in Belfast. So,
Yeah.
welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to you.
So, I'll give a brief introduction. I think most people here know me, but my name is Elaine Disbro, oldest daughter of John and Michelle. Grew up here at Redeemer, left for a while, went to school in Chicago initially. I'm saying all this partly as I think this will lead into where we're going with the topic today. So, initially studied international relations for my bachelor's degree, later got a master's degree in communication while I was living and working in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then most recently, decided to kind of make another career pivot and went back to school for a master's degree in conflict transformation and social justice. Spent not quite a year and a half living in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And if you want to go ahead to the first slide there, Mom. So, a little bit about the program and just what I was studying there. So, to be honest, I did not really know what conflict transformation was. When I signed up for the program, when people asked me before I left, I often said, oh, it's conflict resolution, it's peace building. And it is all of that, but it's a lot more. So we'll get into that. How I ended up in Northern Ireland was a bit serendipitous. I had actually taken a vacation to Ireland. I took a solo road trip for my birthday in 2023 and drove around all over the island, really fell in love with the country. And not long after that, had kind of already been thinking about going back to school, but found the program at Queen's University Belfast, which is the largest university in Northern Ireland. And it just kind of fit exactly what I was looking to study. And I felt that it was important to study in a context that had experienced the issues that I wanted to look at. And so Belfast was a great place for that. The program itself was very interdisciplinary. And kind of depending on where you were coming from and what your sort of focus or interest was, you could have taken it a lot of different directions. So there were a few sort of core classes that everybody took, kind of introducing us to conflict transformation and social justice. I also had the opportunity to take classes in conflict intervention, conflict mediation, democratic innovation, so looking at peace building and democratic society specifically, religion and peace building was a separate course, and then anthropology of conflict. So that's all just to say that I did not really focus on the legal side of things. That was a different area that some of my classmates chose to pursue, and touches a lot more on sort of the justice areas. So I'm not going to get too much into that. That was a part of the program, but again, kind of depending on your focus and things. That's fine, Mom. You can go ahead, Ford. Um, so I guess I'd just like to start with what is conflict transformation? I don't know if anybody here has any thoughts, if you're familiar with that term at all, or if anyone would like to take a guess as to what they think conflict transformation might be referring to. You can also cheat and look at the slide there. There is a brief definition there. So these are kind of the three main conflict areas that I think a lot of people would be familiar with. So we start with conflict management, which the goal of that would really be the reduction of direct violence. So conflict management theories assume conflict can't be fully resolved, but can be minimized. And so it is working to reduce direct violence through things like ceasefires, power sharing agreements, again, focusing on the prevention of violence, not really addressing the root causes. And the picture I have here is actually my family when they came over to visit, standing in front of one of the larger sections of peace walls in Belfast. So the peace walls would be an example of that conflict management, physically separating the communities there by putting a large barrier up between them. And those walls still remain all over the city.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Um, in that way of thinking of it, does violence refer just to physical violence?
Yes. And we'll get
Like
to
emotional violence.
Mhm.
This is physical violence.
Yes. So
Okay.
that's also focusing on just the direct kind of physical violence that we most commonly think of. We will get to that in one of the next, because there is broader understandings of violence as well and what that can mean. The next that a lot of people, again, might commonly think of conflict resolution would be then resolving through negotiation or mediation. The goal being to end the conflict, again, more of the violent, direct conflict that we think of, and reach an agreement between the opposing sides. So for this, you would think of something like the Good Friday Agreement, which is the picture I have there. That is Taoiseach Bertie Ahern of the Republic of Ireland, Tony Blair, Prime Minister for the UK, and George Mitchell, who is the lead negotiator of the Good Friday Agreement. So that's kind of a classic example of conflict resolution, high-level diplomacy. Conflict transformation then. So this is really an approach to addressing conflict that goes beyond the other two. So beyond just managing the conflict or resolving the dispute, and seeks to address the underlying structures, relationships, and the dynamics that create and sustain conflict. So it's a long-term multi-level approach that is really looking for a sustainable peace. Conflict transformation, importantly, as we'll get to in a minute here, also really argues that you can't ignore the peace builders on the ground. So it's looking a lot at the root causes and things at a very local level as part of the whole approach to conflict transformation. And one of the books I have here, which I highly recommend, The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Peacebuilding by John Paul Lederach. He is considered probably one of the founders of conflict transformation specifically. And he talks about the moral imagination as the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships and embracing the complexity of conflict and relationship without sort of polarity. So if you want to skip ahead, Mom, to the next one there. So, and I guess just to go back to that last one, the picture I had there was a picture of one of the murals in Belfast where they're shaking hands across the divide. So again, the example here being grassroots peace building, interfaith dialogue, cross-community work is what we think of when we think of conflict transformation. So this is just, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but wanted to kind of share a couple of key theories from the field that I think are helpful for the larger conversation. The first one here, Galtung's theory of violence. Johann Galtung is the father of peace and conflict studies as a field. And his little triangle here, the three corners representing direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So this kind of gets into the question from earlier. So direct violence being the obvious forms of violence that we think about, visible intentional harm, physical assault, murder, war. Structural violence, then, one of the other corners, we're talking more about the systematic harm that's built into and embedded in social structures and institutions. So for that, we would think of oppression, discrimination, marginalization, discriminatory laws, unequal access to healthcare and education, economic policies that exacerbate inequalities are structural forms of violence. And then the last corner being cultural violence. So that's the norms, ideologies, and symbols that are legitimizing that direct and structural violence then. So that's often media, and today maybe social media would be a form of cultural violence. And Galtung uses that, again, the concept of the triangle, just to visualize the interconnectedness of those ideas, that they're causally linked and reinforcing each other. So it isn't enough to address direct violence without also addressing structural violence. Next is the idea of negative and positive peace. So this is also a key theory of Galtung. Negative peace is the absence of direct violence or fear of violence. And this is where we would say Northern Ireland is today. They are at a place of negative peace. Most places are actually probably at a state of negative peace. Positive peace, which again goes back to those ideas of conflict transformation, is the absence of those other forms of violence, structural violence, cultural violence, the integration of human society, if you will. So that's, again, just to sort of separate the two. A lot of people, it maybe doesn't sound good to say negative peace, like it doesn't sound very positive. It's negative, but it's acknowledging that there is more work to be done. It's still peace. It's just not the end state that we really want to reach.
What would be an example of positive peace?
That's a great question. And I would say there aren't actually a ton of true examples of that, because most places, especially what we think of when we think of places that have gone through peace processes even, are stuck in kind of a negative, maybe moving to positive peace space. But and that's again kind of what we can get to at the end with the work of reconciliation and remembrance. That's really the work that needs to be done to fully move to a positive peace. And kind of the structural piece as well. A lot of societies have not done much to address the structural problems that are contributing to that. So it's hard to say that they've really fully moved to that state when they're kind of more in between those two areas. Moving on then to just the liberal piece, which again, I think is probably what a lot of people think of when we think of peace. It's the promotion of liberal democracy, democratic values, market-oriented reform often. And so we'll see with the liberal piece, this is an international relations idea as well, but external interventions are often justified to promote peace and stability. So we could talk about humanitarian interventions in various countries where the US has militarily intervened out of a sense of promoting our democratic values. Yep.
Market-oriented reform, that sounds like economic.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And specifically capitalists. So we're talking about a free market system. That is what we are often promoting when we talk about those values, and go into a lot of different countries. And again, there are arguments on both sides that you see a lot actually with some of the conflicts in the 90s. There was an idea around the responsibility to protect, the idea that the enlightened, more globalized countries had a duty to intervene in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, and in an effort to promote those liberal democratic values and protect the people. And there's a lot of debates around that, whether that was really what ended up happening in places like that. You also see, on the other hand, we didn't intervene in Rwanda and other countries. So was that a failure then of liberal democracy, and is there a duty inherent in that?
I'm pretty sure that liberal democracy does not refer to the current conservative thing, but can you define what liberal means in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I guess liberal, this is the term is not liberal in the sense of we're thinking, thank you for clarifying that, liberal and conservative. Yes, it's not left-wing in any way. It's really again more about it really comes from international relations, political theory, and it is, let's see if I put my notes here. Well, it's kind of, so it's assuming that like democratic states want to work together. It's talking about ideas of war and peace and power, and not, so it's not liberal in the sense that we often think of as liberal, but it's promoting democratic values, again, our system of peace, essentially, the Western ideal.
Can we think of it along the lines of societies and cultures that want to expand personal freedom as opposed to restrict it? I mean, is that?
Yeah,
kind of the-
that's probably a fair assessment as well. I mean, it's often in opposition to
Right.
more authoritarian systems in places that would be restricting those type of values.
And then arises always the need to have some compromise because you can't go too far in that direction, or I mean,
Yeah,
that's the.
yeah, there's
The conflict arises around that, I assume.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So always kind of trying to find that balance. And it's, I think, a disconnect as well between what's happening locally and what's happening on the international level. And this is more speaking to kind of that like higher level, but oftentimes what's happening, you know, at the top of the political system is not what people are seeing and feeling on the ground. And then just the last one there, then grassroots peace building. Again, this is really a kind of key part of conflict transformation. Lederach's idea that sustainable peace has to be firmly embedded in the grassroots of a local community. Otherwise, it won't be sustainable in long term. So it's a bottom-up approach, community-driven, locally led. And we can see that type of work in dialogue, in cross-community work, in work around reconciliation to heal divisions at a local level.
The hands off yesterday,
Yes. Yep,
and city after city after
exactly.
city.
Exactly. And each of those protests had their own kind of local flavor or local issues that they were maybe more focused on. So, yep, that's a great example. Any other questions before we move on?
If you're gonna get to this later, but I'm thinking of South Africa and
Mhm.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so forth. I mean, maybe there was one brief example, but for positive peace.
Yeah.
Seems like that's really hard. I think Camelot would be the example of positive peace.
Yeah.
That was
It's a very,
real, but
it is almost, it's hard to find good examples of that. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more next week about the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but
I'm interested in how that got started and then
Mhm.
sort of eroded and.
Yeah.
So we'll take that later. Okay.
yeah, it's an interesting case because it was at least doing a lot of the work around trying to reconcile and remember and address those issues. Some critiques around how that was done, and there was a very religious emphasis in that process that some people appreciated and some people didn't. So, but yeah, again, it's almost hard to talk about conflict transformation because there aren't a lot of great examples of it in the world. It's a very long-term goal that we're kind of always working towards, but never quite reaching, it seems. So
I do think Camelot is still a good, I mean, it's the aspiration
Yeah.
always of what's there. That
yeah, exactly. Do you want to go ahead? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of negative versus positive peace.
Yeah.
Historically, would Pax Romana be an example of negative peace?
Yeah. I mean, again, a lot of what we actually think of as very positive times were more just an absence of the direct violence and those type of issues. So yes, that would be, I would say, more an example, maybe working towards, I mean, that is a good example of times where a lot of different groups were working together. It was a very peaceful period in world history, but yeah, still more just not the outright violence that we're used to in so many cases. So this slide, it's a little bit hard to read there, but if you have a copy in front of you, gets into a bit more of the levels here. So again, moving from sort of the sustainable peace and that grassroots level we have. So the pyramid, and we talk about a lot in peace building and conflict work about the different tracks of diplomacy. So we typically divide it into track 1, 2, and 3. This one has kind of a middle section, but track 1 being high level, probably what we most often think of when we think of peace building and conflict resolution, which again is typically done by a few representatives, leaders of various governments or groups, a international mediator who's probably a powerful figure of some background, and this is often resulting in, again, peace agreements, things at that kind of very top level. That's important, but it doesn't always, and we'll see, I think in the case of Northern Ireland, doesn't necessarily trickle down to the levels below that. More at the middle here then. So again, this example adds in kind of a 1.5 track there, which is more the informal conversations. So kind of the dialogues and things, again, probably between more of the political leaders and people, but isn't necessarily that formal peace negotiations, but is important conversations happening below that. The middle level, so track 2 is what we think of mostly as civil society. So those would be, and this is where I would actually typically put religious work as more that track 2 level. So again, I mean, it can be different kind of maybe more powerful figures or things, but is happening at a level that's between the grassroots and the upper level. So the important part of track 2 work is that they are engaging with the grassroots. They're often working both down and up. And then finally, again, the track 3 level, the grassroots piece, local peace building that we've kind of touched on before. So any questions? We'll move on. So just a short little example here, just to get, I was thinking a little bit about conflict mediation. So this is kind of a classic example that is often used in trainings around conflict mediation. So you have 2 children who are fighting over an orange. Let's say they're 2 siblings, maybe. They both claim the orange is theirs and they refuse to share. You, let's say, as the parent or adult, have to try to resolve the conflict. So what would you do?
Deny it to both of them.
Like,
Yeah.
and that's probably a common approach. Yep. Equity, right? You've divided it in half and they each get a half of the orange.
Ask them how they might solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. Ask them to do it themselves.
The classic parenting one is to have one of them cut it in half, but the other one gets the first bit. That's it.
Is that what you-
That was my mother's strategy.
Okay.
So if you ever staff somebody, they want to share, like, would you like to share that? They've already teaching that. No, sometimes
As a teacher.
the teacher and me would try to convince the other, you just want to share them.
Mm,
No, he had some.
Oh, was that what you were going to say or something?
That's fine.
Okay.
Maybe find somebody who needed it more.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So all very valid suggestions. One of the things we talk about in mediation is figuring out the understory. Why is it that the kids each want the orange? So what does the orange mean to them? Why does it matter? Maybe one of them wants the peel because they're making a dessert, and the other one wants the inside because they want to make orange juice. And by cutting it in half, you've denied both of them what they're actually wanting to get out of the orange. So trying to, before going to, solutions and the things we would typically think of, understanding what's driving the conflict, why it escalated, making both groups feel understood and heard to help. And again, you may not be able to give them what they both want. That's would be ideal, but that isn't always going to happen. But it's figuring out maybe a different solution that works for them, or finding a way that they can both get some of what they need.
This is a that's a really intriguing example. The first thing I thought of though was children don't have a deep history necessarily, like a nation that's gone through decades of stuff.
Mhm.
Then my next thought was, yeah, but adults act too much like children. I mean, you know,
Exactly.
if we could only get adults to behave at the level of 12-year-olds, we'd be, you know.
Well, and even, if you take the example, let's say they're both siblings, maybe one just wants the orange because they feel like the other sibling always
Right.
gets it. And, there are different, it's, I think to your point, important to sort of understand the dynamics that are going on between the different groups, whoever it is.
Because then I was thinking, if you escalate that all the way up to a country that once feels they have a right to have nuclear weapons, and their neighbors say, no, you don't. Okay, now, how do we mediate that? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a
And that's where it gets
sense of entitlement
Yeah.
and oppression and all kinds of.
absolutely. And it's very, again, I don't want to be
Right.
simplistic about it. I mean, it's
Right.
very hard. That's why it's so hard to reach peace agreements and things, even on that high level, because you're dealing with those type of issues.
Not that children can't raise things to a nuclear level. I mean, I've seen that too. Confidence.
Yeah. So again, yeah. go ahead.
Well, I wasn't even thinking this deeply because you're children, but I didn't say it, but I was gonna say, well, I might ask, well, why do you think you should have it? Kind of in a joking way, but maybe I would be surprised.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So again, I think it just helps to get kind of thinking about what's actually going on beneath what might appear to be a pretty straightforward surface level conflict. And that kind of, if you want to go to the next slide, Mom, leads us into really Northern Ireland. So I'm curious, we'll go a bit into kind of the history and the roots of that conflict and what I experienced living there, but I'm curious to know what people might already know about the Troubles, if you have a familiarity with that from the news or other things, if you have a perspective on it already.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Most of my current thoughts on it had to do with either finding your roots or who do you think you are episodes of people's family histories. So they've gone, your family is from, this part of Ireland, or your family's from that part of Ireland, and you visit it or you hear the history of it or something like that. So that's been an interesting take on it. Particularly to watch David Tennant, who is, a Scotsman who has family history in Northern Ireland, and because a lot of the Irish moved to
Absolutely.
Scotland,
Yeah.
and him going over and seeing the extreme UK nationalism, the extreme worship of Queen Elizabeth, basically. When he's really an anti-monarchist and is not really a big fan of, the UK government at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's.
I was just gonna say, I was pretty young when, this all blew up, but it was interesting, my perceptions of the Troubles were skewed by the media presentation. And it's really interesting to look back on that because it was so pro-British and demonized the IRA and no real understanding of the historical things that fed into this whole thing. And it wasn't until later I saw some different things like either movies or whatever, and came to realize, wow, this is super nuanced. I had no clue what was going on. But yeah, I just remember feeling like, very anti-Irish IRA and very pro-British And that all those incidents that happened in England with bombings and things were, oh, obviously terrorist attacks by a terrorist group, so it was a long time before I understood the complexity of things.
Yep.
I still don't completely understand it.
I it was a long time ago in my life too, but and maybe because I grew up with this in the town that I grew up with, but I remember thinking a lot of it Catholic and Protestant. And that was a division in my little town too. So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably the main, what people know of it even today is it's Catholic versus Protestant. That's the simplified version.
And I, and I've more recently learned about like the causes of the Irish potato famine,
right.
not just for Northern Ireland, but for the rest of the island, and what the British did to them for centuries.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you can see whose side I'm on.
Well, and I think it's interesting, depending on where you are, you get different versions of history and different versions of the same story. So,
Right, like the War of Northern Aggression.
yes, we have plenty of examples and parallels to a lot of this here in the US. So it's not to say this is like an other place problem. It's common to a lot of societies. You can see this in the Middle East right now in the conflict between Israel and Gaza. So, if you want to go ahead to the next
Well,
slide.
and the allegiances of Irish people to
To-
what's going on.
Yes, which we'll get to. I have some photos of just kind of that, but
The Irish took the various Native Americans.
yeah, yep, exactly. So, just before we kind of get to the Troubles, specifically, wanted to talk a little bit then about the roots of the conflict. So a few people have alluded to it, but the period, really going back into the 1500s, reign of Queen Elizabeth, but you have a process of what is often referred to as the plantation of Ulster, which is essentially the colonization of Ireland by the British. It was an effort, a planned effort to move English and Scottish farmers, settlers over, giving them often the best lands in Ireland to farm and displacing the native population. So what you really had was, so again, and this map kind of shows it here, it's a little bit hard to see. That is the whole island of Ireland. The northern portion is what we're focusing on here, and that is the province. So Ireland is divided into a bunch of counties. You may have heard of some of those ones. County Clare, yeah, exactly. So those are somewhat analogous to our states, but there are also 4 large provinces within Ireland, and the northern portion is Ulster. So you'll often hear people sometimes conflate Northern Ireland with Ulster. It's not a perfect overlap, but that region is the province of Ulster. And so you have a process again where over a period of time, English and a lot of Scottish settlers. So that's where you're talking about family history. You have quite a lot of influx of Scottish. You get a group of people, they're called the Ulster Scots, that eventually immigrated to America. So you also sort of have this pattern of people moving from places and a large group who eventually settled here. But I think it's just important to again, sort of acknowledge that during this period, it was a planned process where groups were granted land, settlers were not employing the local population, and that's why you also had the displacement of the native Irish to more the western areas of the island. Those also still today are strongholds of the Gaelic language, so the native areas where Irish continued to flourish, and a lot of the other side where it's kind of wiped out. And importantly in this, you also have then the sort of origins of this split between Catholic and Protestant, because a lot of the settlers coming over were Protestant settlers from a England that was recently, formally made Protestant under Henry VIII and then continued under Elizabeth and the reigns of James after that. So plantation really produced a large British and English interest in Ireland, a body of Irish Protestants who were tied through religion, politics, and shared culture to English power, and derived a lot of their power from that connection to England. So, also just to say quickly, the image I have here is William of Orange, who later becomes king, and leads some significant battles throughout Ireland, but essentially overtakes. I don't want to get too much into the history, but 1690 is kind of a key date for a lot of Protestants still in Ireland today. It was the Battle of the Boyne and sort of the successful victory of William of Orange, and it is still celebrated throughout Northern Ireland today.
Yeah, let's be clear. So, and I'm asking this.
Yeah.
You use terms like the plantation of Ireland and settlers,
Mhm.
but this was a violent displacement, correct?
Yes. And so again, depending on who you're hearing it from, history records this as the plantation of Ulster. A lot of, if you're reading more of an Irish history, would say the violent colonization by the British of the Irish.
Okay.
But again, depending on the story you're getting,
Mhm.
you get a different perspective on it. If you want to go ahead, Mom. So that kind of brings us up to the partition. And just a couple of kind of key events leading up to this then. So between that period we talked about from the plantation up until partition, Ireland was ruled by the UK, but has a very large Catholic nationalist majority who want self-governance and ultimately independence for Ireland from the United Kingdom. So they were working for, at that time, a devolved government, which would have been bringing rule back from Parliament in London to Dublin and having what's known as home rule for the island. So this leads to the home rule crisis, which really goes from like 1910 to 1914 up until World War One. At the same time, in the northern part, you have the Ulster Unionists. So again, Ulster referring to kind of the northern part, Unionists being people who want to remain a part of the Union, who are very much in power and are the majority in the north and are vehemently opposed to home rule. So they actually created during this time the Ulster Volunteers, which was essentially a large paramilitary force. But the goal was to show their strength and prevent Ulster from being ruled by a devolved government in Dublin. They did not want home rule. They wanted to be a full part of the United Kingdom and were opposed to that process. So while you have all of that going on, this conflict already kind of between the North and South, you get World War One, which really interrupts this whole thing. People from both sides, Catholic and Protestant, go off to World War One. So this is not to say that only the Protestants, the people who wanted to be part of the UK were supporting that. A large number of people did go off and fight alongside British forces in World War One. But during that time, you still had a lot of support for Irish independence, which really kind of only increased during the war as British attention was elsewhere. And so this culminates in the Easter Rising of 1916, which is kind of the famous armed rebellion. That's where you see sort of the forces for Irish nationalism actually took over a bunch of government buildings in Dublin, seized them. It was quite brief. It was crushed fairly quickly, but essentially planted the seeds again of this resistance movement that continued. So after World War One ends in 1918, soldiers are coming home. You have that kind of process wrapping up. You get to the again, depending on whose view you're talking about, either the Anglo-Irish War or the Irish War of Independence. And this was between the Irish Republican Army, which is the earlier version of the IRA that we know today, and British forces. And so there's a years-long conflict within the island itself over this issue of independence, which ultimately brings us to the partition. So there was a truce in 1921. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was what eventually concluded that war, essentially, and created what is the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland chose to remain a part of the United Kingdom. The Irish Free State was granted their devolved government essentially more autonomy and independence, and eventually in 1937 was renamed Ireland. 1949 becomes the Republic of Ireland that it is today. So 49 is when it officially becomes the Republic of Ireland. But really 1937 is when it's renamed Ireland and is thought of pretty much from then on. There's different processes and the Constitution being created and things. But again, that's where you get this separation between the two. And so again, some of these seeds, the real animosity between the Unionists in the North and the Nationalists in the South is what we see then in the Troubles, because while Northern Ireland was partitioned, that's not to say that everybody in the North is Unionist. There is a very large Catholic minority population in the North. So if you want to go ahead, Mom.
As you might see if you ever watch Dairy Girls.
Yes, which is a great show. I highly recommend. If we have time for it, there's a clip I wanted to try to get to. That's a great example of it. But so the Troubles itself then is typically thought of as 1968 to 1998. So this is the period of 30 years of violent conflict in Northern Ireland. It is as we've kind of seen, complex and deeply rooted ethno-national conflict, we would consider it, centering around issues of identity, Irish versus British, sovereignty, who has the right to control the land, and those historical grievances that we talked about with the plantation. So you see a lot of social inequality, economic disparities, and religious division. And that is what was largely driving the conflict. Just to quickly say the numbers there. So I heard recently, I heard someone talk about what this would have looked like if it happened in the US at this time. So these numbers might not seem high. Northern Ireland is a small place. Ireland itself, not a very big island. If a conflict of this scale happened in the US, you would have had 800,000 dead, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings in a 30-year period.
Wow.
So I think that gives a better sense of the scale of how destructive this was to the entire society there. No one was unaffected. Even people who may have lived in areas that were less directly affected by the violence, and the trickle-down effects of this throughout the generations are still really being seen and felt now. Go ahead, Mom, to the next.
Well, what's that picture? I'm just curious.
That is a IRA funeral for Bobby Sands, who was one of the famous hunger strikers, which we'll get to on the next slide.
Question.
Yeah.
I can never remember what color is orange. Is it the Protestant and Catholic?
So orange is actually the Protestants. Green would be the Catholics. Yeah. And sometimes they talk about, so oftentimes people talking about the tricolor. It's a little bit confusing because the Irish flag has both green and orange, right? You think, so they'll sometimes refer to that as green and gold to distinguish it from the orange of the Protestants. And orange for the Protestants comes largely from one of the groups I'll talk about here, but also from William of Orange, who is the Protestant figure that is still very much idealized and a part of the history here. So orange for the Protestants then.
For what it's worth, department, William and Mary, where our son went.
Yeah. Was Yes,
Their colors are green and gold.
yes, yep. And that was, I believe, because they, William, yeah, yeah, chartered. I was gonna say, I couldn't remember the affiliation, but yes. Yep.
However, Princeton University, which was from, also had connections to William of Orange and the House of Nassau. Nassau Hall is their main thing. They are orange and black, orange because of the way they're orange.
Yeah.
Matters not to anybody at all. The stuff trickles down the decades, that's what I'm saying.
It really does. So just to quickly talk about key groups here. So again, we kind of tend to group it into Catholics and Protestants. Within the Catholic side, that's more commonly, you would call those nationalists or Republicans, who are supporting a united Ireland, and want to be fully independent. On the other side, you have the Unionists, who want to remain part of the Union, are loyal to the British Crown. And within those two groups, then I want to say you had a lot of paramilitaries on both sides. So people mostly think about the IRA, which is the best known Republican paramilitary group. You also had another major one called the INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, and today you have splinter groups of those. So there are still paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland on both sides. They're not quite the same as the ones that were operating during the Troubles, but they are still there. On the Protestant side, then, the main ones being the UVF, which is the Ulster Volunteer Force. That was actually, I talked about the IRA fighting the British back in the time of partition. The UVF is the Ulster Volunteer Force that came out of that original paramilitary group that was formed in Northern Ireland to oppose home. So both of those have, kind of a much longer history than we typically associate with. The UDA is another major paramilitary group on the Protestant side. And then politically, you have different groups as well. So a lot of people probably have heard of Sinn Féin, which often is thought of as the political wing of the IRA. And then the SDLP was for a long time another major party on the Catholic nationalist side. On the Protestant side, you have the DUP. The UUP was the largest party for a long time, the Ulster Unionist Party. That would have been the party associated with Unionist interests and promoting that. And then just to say, before I get to the British in the middle, the images here, so that's kind of the IRA on the one side, probably the most recognizable group associated with the conflict on that side. On the other side, I have a picture actually of a group called the Loyal. They're called the Orange Order commonly, but they are a group that I actually studied while I was there, and are a Protestant fraternity organization, essentially. So associated very much with Ulster Protestants, and were a very large cultural force. They're still very active. They're part of they parade every summer. So if you've heard of marching season in Northern Ireland, those are the guys that go out for.
Well, don't they have lodges and stuff?
Yes, so that's what LOL is for Loyal Orange Lodge. That's their.
It's sort of like the moose and the elks and
Yes,
the lions.
It's very similar to all of that. So in the middle, then quickly you have the British states. So as the conflict is breaking out, the British sent in the army, and within that, then you also have the police locally. That would have been the Royal Ulster Constabulary at the time. We would like to think of police as more of a neutral force, but they were largely Protestant and often did not intervene when there was violence done in Catholic communities, or were sometimes contributing to that. You also have a group called the Ulster Constabulary, or the B Specials. This was a quasi-military reserve force that was also predominantly Protestant. So just important to say that the police and the British troops especially were very distrusted by the Catholic community. And so they kind of become a third part of this conflict that exacerbated essentially the violence. I'm gonna skip ahead, Mom. We're getting short on time. Just wanted to highlight a couple of key events here during this period. There are so many things that happened during this conflict. It's almost hard to to pull out kind of key moments. The troubles really began with a civil rights movement that is very much parallel and part of the civil rights movement that was going on in the US and around the world at the same time. So in the model of Martin Luther King and nonviolent protests, there were a lot of civil rights marches in Northern Ireland. This arose really from a lot of nationalist or Catholic grievances against the Protestant unionist dominated government. And Catholics had faced a lot of discrimination in housing, jobs, political representation. Things were very gerrymandered, similar to what we might know today, where it was almost impossible for Catholics to get elected in areas that were a Catholic majority. So they had very little political representation as well. There was a lot of, again, organized marches. On the other side, the Unionists viewed a lot of these marches and civil rights activities as what they would call a Republican front. So pushing for Republican goals and ultimately this goal of a united Ireland that they were opposed to. So you had a lot of loyalist mobs and even police attacking the marchers. A couple key events within that, probably the most famous being Bloody Sunday, which was the end of this period in 1972 when British soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians during a civil rights march in the city of Derry, or Londonderry, as it is also called, depending on which side you're on. That kind of leads into and overlaps with the next period, which is internment. So this was the mass arrest and detention without trial of people suspected of being in the IRA. This was an attempt to crush the IRA by the British state, and it entirely targeted pretty much exclusively people from the nationalist Catholic background. So you had a lot of people in prison during this period, again, kind of mass incarceration. This did not crush the IRA. In fact, it really ramped up the troubles because it was a great recruitment tool when you have a lot of people who are arrested without cause. So it really led more people to actually join the Republican movement and increased the violence. Some of these years are some of the deadliest during the conflict. Eventually, you get up to the hunger strikes, which is kind of the culmination of years of protest by nationalists and Republican prisoners. So those people who were interned and some who were, credibly members of the IRA and were arrested. That's not to say everybody was not doing violence, but the issue was essentially around their status as prisoners of war versus common criminals. The British state wanted to call them criminals. The prisoners wanted special status and considered themselves prisoners of war and with a political purpose, essentially. So not seeing themselves in the way that they were common criminals was how they were treated. So some of the ways that they fought back against this were hunger strikes. This was there was several during this time, the most notable being the 1981 strike. And I mentioned Bobby Sands earlier, which is the picture of his funeral. He was the first hunger striker, the first to die. During his hunger strike, he was actually elected to the UK Parliament. So he was incarcerated, but was overwhelmingly elected. And so essentially it was a very bad look for Margaret Thatcher and the British government. Ultimately, 10 prisoners starved themselves to death. All of these funerals were huge events. Thousands and thousands of people packed the streets. It was a big propaganda victory for the IRA, really, again, sort of boosting recruitment and leading to a new cycle of violence in the 80s. Eventually, we get to a period of secret peace talks, and we'll talk a lot more about that next week because there are some key religious figures. You'll see in one of the lower pictures here, the man who's bending over, that's actually the dead body of a British soldier, giving him the last rites. That's Father Alec Reid. He's a kind of key figure in a secret peace process that has begun in the late 1980s. First, just bringing together people on the nationalist side. So getting the main political parties and sort of approved faces of the nationalist side at the time to meet with and talk with the IRA, who were considered, a paramilitary force that no one wanted to touch, essentially. But getting them together to have first secret negotiations, coming to a consensus, and then eventually facilitating larger talks with the British state, the Irish government, and parties on the other side. All of that work, and again, I think this sort of shows the long timeline of peace work as well. Beginning in 1988, you don't have the official ceasefires until 1994. So the IRA eventually does call a cessation of all military activities. Loyalist paramilitaries on the other side followed not long after that. So there was a full ceasefire. Unfortunately, it was broken as well, so it didn't last indefinitely, but luckily the peace process was able to continue. And that gets us to the Good Friday Agreement and referendum, which was, again, if you think of that pyramid, track one peace process, a political deal between the British, Irish governments, and the major parties in Northern Ireland. So that was signed on Good Friday, April 10th, 1998, which sort of officially ended the Troubles. And it was really based on ideas of power sharing between the two communities that continues today. So it set up a power sharing government. It was approved also by referendum. So it went to the voters of North and South, and was overwhelmingly approved by everyone. So I'm going to skip ahead, Mom. If you get a chance, I don't know if we'll have time here. This is a funny video from Dairy Girls just talking about differences, but we'll skip ahead now. So
skip for now.
yeah, I think we're
Come back.
if we get a chance, we'll come back at the end. If you want to stay late and watch, it's a very funny one. But I note this actually before you move on, just to say, a lot of people would say, I think before I went over there would have said Ireland is a post-conflict society. They've solved it. They did the peace process and they have had 30 years of peace now, right? But post-conflict, post-violent conflict, yes. Is it post-conflict? No. And again, if we think back to those positive and negative peace, like I said, Northern Ireland is a very good example of a negative peace. If you want to skip to the next slide, Mom. So these are just a few images that I took from around Belfast, and I think highlight sort of the divisions that still remain. So like I said at the beginning, the peace walls are still up all over Northern Ireland. People like them. They don't want them to come down. And that's for several reasons. Partly they're a tourist attraction now, but also they actually feel, in some cases, safer and more secure with the barriers in place. You also have a lot of different murals and imagery in both sides of the community. So the picture on the top left there is the Falls Road in West Belfast, which is a very Catholic nationalist neighborhood, representing all of the different parts of Irish culture and highlighting those. On the far right there, that's actually a mural of Bobby Sands, the first hunger striker who died. And again, he's sort of a martyr, essentially, is really how he's treated within the nationalist community. I do like that you can't read it there, but the words on that mural and part of it are, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." Mm-hmm. The bottom then may be more in contrast to some of the sort of, yes, you still have divisions, peaceful images at the top. As I think my dad mentioned, there's something people in Northern Ireland do called telling. Like anytime you're talking to somebody, you're sort of trying to work out which side they're from. And you can usually tell that in their name, in the activities they're involved with, in the type of school they went to. Education is not integrated in Northern Ireland. You still go to either a Catholic or a Protestant school. Very, very few people go to integrated schools. You have, again, clear divisions in the communities. When you're walking around the city, you can tell which area you're in based on the flags that they have flying. Flags are a big thing there. Oftentimes British or Ulster flags, being the Protestant side. And I came across this interesting example where you see the half British, half Israeli flag. because the conflict in the Middle East is very much seen as a proxy for the same issues and conflict and divisions that remain in Northern Ireland. So you see Israeli flags all over Protestant Unionist neighborhoods, and you will see Palestinian flags all over Catholic and nationalist neighborhoods. And that again is represented where you have the fists, one of the and the other the Palestinian flag. So there's very much a affinity for those same sides in other conflicts. The middle period there, or the middle picture there, just to wrap up, is one of the most fascinating experiences I had there probably was witnessing the July 12th celebrations. July the 12th being William of Orange's victory in the Battle of the Boyne. It is still celebrated as a public holiday in Northern Ireland. It is only celebrated by the Unionist Protestant community. Most Catholics leave town because this is the peak of marching season. So you have on July 11th, bonfires. And these are, I don't know if you can tell there, that is like the height of multiple buildings. That is a multiple story bonfire. These take weeks to build. They pop up all over cities across the north. They often include, you can kind of see in that picture, there's an Irish tricolor flag at the top of it, sometimes images of the Pope and other symbols of the nationalist community that are burned as part of this. And then the next day is when a lot of huge marches happen. So that Orange Order that I talked about comes out in force, marches through streets, bangs their drums and plays music. And it is, one community would say, very much a part of their culture and tradition. The Protestant side sees no problem with it and says they've done it for hundreds of years and intend to continue. The Catholic community feels targeted and harassed and usually chooses to leave town or not go out during that time.
Could I make one personal observation?
Yeah.
Because this feels close to me. This is kind of like with our Civil War, people putting up statues and stuff to the Southern generals and all that thing. It's like they present it as it's history.
Yeah.
We're just celebrating our history.
It's our culture.
Yeah. When it's way, way more than that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Exactly.
Elaine, those things are so scary. That's got to be like a 5-story building right there. And it doesn't look very stable. Like I would be so afraid to be anywhere near that thing when they light that thing up.
And
I can't imagine
yeah.
what the collapse looks like when it all comes stumbling down after burning for a while.
Yeah, it's quite a scene. But last slide, if you will, Mom. I think there's one more. So we'll get a lot more into this next week. But again, just to sort of talk about remembrance and reconciliation. And this is really where Northern Ireland is kind of stuck, I would say. They have not, unlike South Africa and other countries that have actively attempted to do a peace and reconciliation process after their conflict, Northern Ireland has not done that. They are still dealing with a lot of these same issues of identity, very different narratives of history and the conflict itself and what happened. And there's really no sort of shared understanding of things that could start to bring the communities together. That's not to say there isn't a lot of work being done. There are, in local ways, as I got to see, a lot of groups working across the peace barriers to prevent youth violence or to try to do things in a way to help their local community, like their small neighborhood of Belfast. But I think you also get, which is what this picture is, there's a huge amount of remembrance. There are memorials all over the city, very local to the people in that neighborhood who died, to a bomb that went off in this specific place. There are a lot of memorials on both sides to the paramilitaries. So that is what this is. Sandy Row remembers. Sandy Row is a very Protestant neighborhood, or very loyalist, heavily kind of on the extreme side of the Unionist cause. And all of the badges you see there are the different paramilitary groups. And so they're remembering the paramilitary people from their neighborhood who died and sacrificed themselves during the Troubles, not in any way recognizing that those people were doing violence against a community that could be a couple 100 feet down the road. So again, I think we'll get more into it next week. I think kind of especially around reconciliation, but I guess also just to say Brexit really complicated things for Northern Ireland. Like Northern Ireland voted to remain a part of the EU while the rest of the UK voted to leave, narrowly, but voted to leave. And it's really complicated the status of Northern Ireland because they don't want to put a hard border back in place. There is no border when you are driving in Northern Ireland. You don't really know when you've crossed the border into Northern Ireland or going south, and no one wants a border to go back up. But that complicates issues of trade and other things because you are crossing into a different country. And so there's been a lot of political stuff going on actually in the last really couple of years. And while I was there, the government in Stormont actually finally came to an agreement with the UK around essentially what they now call the Irish Sea border. So there's sort of a border in the sea that is where goods that come across from the UK onto the island of Ireland go through different processing and stuff when they arrive. And that agreement allowed the government in Stormont, which is their parliament, their government in Northern Ireland, which is again a power sharing one that is both communities, but finally allowed them to actually come back. They were not functioning for several years. So there's a lot of ongoing issues, a lot of work still to be done, but I think I'll end it there. If anyone would like to stay for the video from Dairy Girl,
If you have any Dairy Girls, this is like the best.
highly recommend if you want to click on that link, Mom. This is just a funny clip.
Can I take a tangent?
Yeah.
Folks might want to watch. There is supposed to be a NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the first one in the United States in a long time, on May 21st and 20 through 26th in Dayton,
Oh,
recognizing the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords.
Yep.
Now, whether that will come off, but the congressman from Dayton is very involved, Mike Turner. The state has appropriated funds for this for security and other things. So that's May 21st through the 26th in Dayton.
Very interesting.
thank you.
And I just want to say, I looked up something because I was trying, when you went over the number of people involved and trying to blow it up to US size, whatever, the area of Northern Ireland is about half the size of Massachusetts. Half the size of Massachusetts. Small, about the 10th the size of well, maybe 11% the size of Ohio.
Yep.
Wow.